Good morning. We're going to talk about chapter 1 this morning in our progress on uh, having a geology class that's a little different than I'm accustomed to. So it'll take me a second to share my screen. You should have the notes and be able to fill in the blanks as we go along. So as you see, we're in chapter 1. It's an introduction. Every book seems to have some sort of an introduction. One of the things I really like about geology is that it uses all of the other sciences to explain the world that we live on, our planet as a whole. The biology is taken into account. If you look at fossils, the chemistry has a lot to do with chemical weathering and with mineral development, and physics is all about the way things break and change due to physical intervention, like freezing water. So we have all of these processes that can explain things like floods or volcanoes or earthquakes. It is an amazing thing to study. So when we talk about the Earth, we think of it as a heat engine. Heat engines use heat energy to produce some sort of end result. Your automobile is a heat engine, unless you have an electric car. In the case of the Earth, the sun heats up the surface and it provides the energy for surface events like rain or wind or things like that. When you're looking at an event that's not a surface event, say, for example, an earthquake or a volcano, that energy comes from deep inside the Earth. The molten material inside the Earth's core rises up because hot things tend to be less dense and rise up, and cold things tend to sink down. And so this hot material is coming up, and the end result is that it will provide energy for earthquakes, volcanoes, tectonic plate movement, all of those sorts of things. As we go along, I hope you'll see the connections. So we will be looking at physical geology this semester. It is concerned with the Earth and its interactions and the materials that the Earth is made out of. There are lots of different kinds of geology. There's historical geology, where it looks at the progression, especially of how fossils are important to the history of the Earth. But we're going to look at physical geology. So let's scroll down and notice this little graphic. So this graphic shows you a sort of pie-shaped piece. The top part is the surface of the Earth, so we're going down, down, down. The center of the Earth in this graphic would be right down here at the very middle. You can see that we have the inner core of the Earth, and you'll notice that it's rigid. The inner core of the Earth is a solid. And then we move outward as we're going from the center of the Earth up to the surface. You have the outer core, and it actually is a liquid. I know that seems hard to believe, but it's true. And then when you keep going, you have the lower mantle and then the upper mantle. The mantle, as you can see in the graphic on the left-hand side, is this sort of darker brown and the light brown, and then this little gray area. All of that's considered the mantle. The mantle is not a liquid, and it's not really a solid. It acts like more like a fluid plastic of some sort, and it tends to get heated up because of heat energy generated in the core of the Earth. That heat energy takes the mantle and makes it pliable so that it can move, and it tends to develop what we call convection currents. So the materials come up, and then when they cool off, they drop back down. So there seem to be circulation patterns in the mantle itself. And then you have the crust on top of that, the Earth's crust on top of this. The three zones or areas you're going to have to be familiar with will be the crust, the mantle, and the core. And we've got a little graphic. Typically on a test, what I'll do is I'll draw a series of nested circles and ask you to find, you know, the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, the crust. And so we should look maybe at that. So typically this would be your little diagram. You'd have a circle and another circle and a third circle. So 3 nested circles. The very outside of those circles is the Earth's crust. If you wanted to envision the Earth as an apple, the crust is about the same thickness as the peel on an apple is when you compare it to the apple itself. So the Earth's crust is really not very thick. Directly below the crust, you have the area of the mantle, and I'm not going to expect you to differentiate between the different layers in the mantle. It's enough for me if you know that it's the mantle directly below the crust. And then when you go a little deeper towards the center, you get the outer core and then the inner core. So if you could label those 4 things on a drawing for me, if I gave you these nested circles and you could pick out these 4 things on that drawing, I would be a happy person. All right, so we've moved along. The movement of hot materials up and cool ones down is called convection. I mentioned this earlier when I talked about the movement of the material in the mantle. Most of the convection in the Earth's core, the Earth itself, takes place in the mantle, and that brings heat energy up to the surface, which powers things like tectonic plate movement or volcanoes or earthquakes. So those sorts of things get their energy from this movement of those hot materials up from the mantle towards the surface. Now, this movement is tied to our understanding of the theory of tectonic plates. So the Earth itself is considered to be broken up in the crust is broken up into chunks that we call tectonic plates. When you have maybe a hard-boiled egg and you crack it, all the little pieces are connected, but they're separate until you peel it off. The Earth's crust is a little like that. So the crust itself is actually thinner under the oceans and thicker under the continents. What happens is brand new crust is usually produced in the middle of the ocean, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So, excuse me, the crust is broken up into these tectonic plates. We will look at this little graphic and see what we can come up with. Here we are. Let's scroll up just a little bit. So the graphic that you see now is really very interesting. The major tectonic plates are labeled. You can see we have the North American plate, the South American plate. This sort of light brown area is the Pacific plate. We have the Eurasian plate over here. The Australian plate. So the big ones are labeled, and a few of the minor plates, for example, the Caribbean plate is this orangey one right here, this little tiny orangey one. What is significant about it, as far as we're concerned, is that plate is where we find the island of Hispaniola. That's where Haiti and the Dominican Republic share the island of Hispaniola, and its location on the plate is the reason why Hispaniola receives so many earthquakes, and we'll talk about that later in the semester also. You can also see on our drawing, besides the identification of the major and a few of the minor plates, these black arrows. These arrows indicate the direction the plates are moving. So for example, right here where we have the North American plate and the Eurasian plate, you'll see that the 2 black arrows actually point away from each other. That tells me that the 2 plates are actually moving apart. And in fact, you know, oh, in this little island right here, that's the country of Iceland. And the reason it has so much volcanic activity and thermal activity is because it's on top of a plate boundary right here. And again, we'll talk about that a little later on. You can see that the plates are pulling apart. And that means that new ocean crust will be created in that location to fill the gap. When the plates pull apart, something's got to happen to take care of the missing space in between. And what happens when the plates separate is that molten material from the mantle comes up to fill the gap. You can see that there are some plates that come together right here where the Pacific plate and this section of the North American plate are located. These two plates come together. Normally, if two plates come together, you get mountain ranges created. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you have places where the plates sort of slide past each other. And that's a little of what's going on right here between this section of the Pacific plate and the North American plate. So we'll discuss all of these plate relationships in just a minute. So let's scroll down so we can see that. So we have three types of plate boundaries. See if I can get, yeah, I can get them, maybe all three to show up. Three types of plate boundaries. You have diverging boundaries. That was when the plates pulled apart. And at diverging boundaries, the plates separate and new ocean crust is created to fill the void, to fill that empty space. That means that new crust is the very youngest crust. You can also have transform boundaries. That's when the plates slide past each other. Usually that's a boundary where you would expect to see a lot of earthquakes. An example of that is the San Andreas Fault. And we'll actually have a lab that looks at part of the San Andreas Fault. And then the third type were the converging boundaries, and that's where the plates move towards each other. So a lot happens at a converging boundary. When the plates come together, you've got a couple of different scenarios. Typically what will happen is one plate gets pushed down and that forces the other one up. So the one that gets forced up makes a mountain range, and the one that gets forced down, that downward thrusted crust is reabsorbed into the mantle. And it's sort of like a recycling, if you will, of the earth crust. Because if at diverging boundaries, material comes up to fill the void, it's got to come from someplace. You can't just keep pushing up and pushing up and pushing up. At some point in time, you've got to replenish your store of materials. And that takes place at converging boundaries. This is a little close-up of the North American and the Caribbean plate and the South American plate. And you can see right here the location. There's actually a fault located right there. And again, a lot of the activity that we see associated with the earthquakes in Haiti is because of its location. And you see we've got color coding of the types of boundaries. So the red is a divergent that happens here and over here on our graphic. The blue is transform. Remember, transform, they slide past each other. The yellow are converging boundaries. They come together. You can see there's a converging boundary right here along the coast of Central America. That's responsible for the mountain ranges that occur down there. All right. Geologic time. Most geologic time moves really slowly. We have a saying called the principle of uniformitarianism that says the present is the key to the past. We will look at that in some detail, but basically what we're saying is that if you look at the way a river flows now, that's the same way rivers flew moved 1,000 or 1,000,000 years ago. If you look at the way a rock breaks now, that's the same as the rock broke millions of years ago. So the present is the key to the past. You've got a little graphic of geologic time, which you can look at, and I think we'll stop.